Welcome to the Crazy Alchemist podcast, where alchemy, occultism, and strange history come alive.
The Catholic Church recognizes around 10,000 named saints. The catalog includes monks who sat on pillars for decades and martyrs whose identities survived only in Roman trial transcripts. Yet Adam and Eve, the figures named on the very first page of the Bible, the source of every human alive, are nowhere to be found. There is no parish church dedicated to Saint Adam in the Latin Rite. There is no Eve medallion in the religious goods shop. The Litany of Saints, recited at every major liturgical celebration in Western Catholic practice, names hundreds of figures and does not include the original ancestors of all humanity. Most Western Catholics, asked whether Adam and Eve are saints, would assume the answer is no. The answer is more interesting than that. They are mentioned in the Roman Martyrology on December 24th in a single line buried among the genealogy of Christ. The Eastern Orthodox Church commemorates them as the first names in the Sunday of the Holy Forefathers, the second Sunday before Christmas. The Mormon tradition identifies Adam with the Archangel Michael and gives him a presiding role over the entire human family. The Quran lists him among the prophets. So the question worth asking is not just why Adam and Eve are largely absent from Western Christian devotion. The deeper question is what every culture in human history has done with the figure of the first couple, and why the West did something specific with them that nobody else did. The story pulls in molecular biology, the Lurianic Kabbalah, comparative mythology, the Council of Trent, and one philological mistake that Augustine made in the early 5th century and that the Greek-speaking East never repeated. Begin with the science. In January 1987, the journal Nature published a paper by 3 geneticists at Berkeley, Rebecca Cann, Mark Stoneking, and Alan Wilson. They analyzed mitochondrial DNA from 147 people drawn from 5 geographic populations. Mitochondrial DNA passes only from mother to child. By tracing the variation backward in time, the Berkeley team reached a single theoretical woman from whom every living person on Earth inherits an unbroken matrilineal line. She lived in Africa, around 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. The paper itself did not call her Eve. The companion piece in the same Nature issue did. A year later, Newsweek put a cover story titled The Search for Adam and Eve on January 11, 1988, with 2 figures in a vague Edenic garden. The scientists adopted the popular name. Mitochondrial Eve entered the textbooks under that name. Y-Chromosomal Adam is the analog for the male side. Tracing the variation in Y chromosomes across living men leads back to a single theoretical man whose unbroken patriline reaches every human male alive today. He also lived in Africa, somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 years ago. Here is the fact nobody mentions when they hear these names for the first time. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-chromosomal Adam never met. They lived tens of thousands of years apart. They are not a couple. They are not the genetic source of all humanity in any couple-shaped way. They are statistical artifacts of how mitochondrial and Y-chromosome inheritance work separately in a population that was never small. When mitochondrial Eve was alive, perhaps 10,000 other women lived in her band and the bands around it. Many had more children than she did. None of that mattered in the end. Her matriline was the one that produced an unbroken sequence of daughters all the way to the present. Every other matriline at some generation produced only sons, and the line ended there. The genetic Adam and Eve are real. They are not who you were taught to imagine. Now, here is the strange part. The Berkeley team could have named their finding the most recent common matrilineal ancestor. They didn't. They reached for Eve. Even materialist geneticists doing molecular biology in a Berkeley lab fell into the same naming pattern that every other culture in human history has used for the same statistical reality. Religion, mythology, and modern molecular biology all use the same metaphor for the same finding: somebody had to be first. So what every other culture has done with that naming is the next question, and the answer rules out a lot of easy assumptions. In Hinduism, Brahma stands above Manu. In Norse myth, Odin stands above Ask and Embla. The same creator-first pattern holds across Shinto, Yoruba, and Aztec cosmogony. The Christian demotion of Adam and Eve below the Trinity is not a Christian peculiarity, it is the universal logic of creator religion. Worship moves up to creators, not down to the created. So the first answer to why are Adam and Eve not holy is the deflationary one. They sit in the universal slot where every culture's first couple sits, below the gods who made them. But the comparative tour gets stranger. Almost every cosmogonic tradition produces some version of a first couple, often brother-sister, often flood survivors, often with one member dying and becoming foundational. In Japan, Izanagi and Izanami descended from heaven onto the floating bridge above the ocean and stirred the water with a jeweled spear. From the drops that fell, the first island formed. They built a pillar, walked around it from opposite sides, and met. Their first child was deformed because Izanami spoke first in the wedding circling, the wrong order in a patriarchal cosmos. They redid the ritual, with Izanagi speaking first, and produced the islands of Japan and the Kami. Izanami died giving birth to fire. Izanagi went down to the underworld to retrieve her, saw her rotting, and fled, sealing the entrance with a boulder.
In China, Fuxi and Niwa, brother and sister with human upper bodies and intertwined serpentine tails. After a great flood destroyed all other humans, they were the only survivors. They lit 2 fires on separate peaks and let the smoke decide whether they could marry. The smoke twined. They repopulated humanity. Han Dynasty tomb art from the 2nd century shows them with their tails wound around each other in a double helix, 1,000 years before anyone in modern biology knew that DNA itself looks similar. In India, Manu, the Vedic flood survivor and progenitor of humanity. The Sanskrit word Manu is cognate with English man, in German Mensch. A small fish, later identified as an avatar of Vishnu, warned Manu of a coming flood. He built a boat, tied it to the fish's horn, was towed to a northern mountain, and survived alone. From his sacrifice rose his consort Ida, sometimes named Shraddha, and humanity descended. In Norse mythology, Odin and 2 brother gods walking on a shore found 2 pieces of driftwood, an ash tree and an elm. Odin gave breath. Hoenir gave spirit, Loder gave blood. They became Ask and Embla, the first humans. The patterns recur with striking consistency across the planet: brother-sister pairing, flood survivor repopulation, sacrificed mothers whose bodies become foundational, failed first children corrected on the second try, a vegetal or material origin for the first humans. The first couple is universal as story. The Genesis Adam and Eve are not unusual, they are the local Mediterranean version of a story every culture on Earth tells. Here is where the conversation usually breaks down. The Western reader thinks, well, we worship ancestors instead, like the Confucians do or the Africans do. That is not exactly right. The 2 practices are different. Ancestor veneration is a practice. People bow at altars to specific named family dead, going back a few generations. Slavic Dziadi, Confucian Jisi, Shinto Oban, Yoruba Egungun all do this. The first couple is a story. Izanagi and Izanami, Fuxi and Niwa, Adam and Eve are characters in cosmogonic narrative. They are almost never the object of household altar practice. The Kenyan theologian John Mbiti, in a 1969 book called African Religions and Philosophy, coined a term for the active object of African ancestor cults. He called them the living dead. The living dead are the recent kin, up to about 4 or 5 generations back, who are still remembered by name. Once unnamed, they pass into collective immortality and lose individual cult attention. Mbiti is explicit that the living dead are not the same as the cosmogonic first couple. The same boundary holds in East Asia. The Chinese family altar honors named family dead going back a few generations. Fuxi and Nuwa do not appear at the family altar. They are mythology, present in temples and iconography, but not in cult practice. In Japan, the household kamidana and butsudan honor specific kami and the named family dead. Izanagi and Izanami appear at major shrines, but not on household altars. The strong claim holds across every culture I checked. No major culture has historically practiced active cult veneration of the literal cosmogonic first couple. The first couple is the story everyone in the culture shares. The cult object is the named family chain. So the answer to why don't we worship Adam and Eve is partly structural to all religion. They sit in the universal slot where in every tradition the first couple sits, as story, not as object of household veneration. What remains to explain is what the West did on top of that universal lower ranking. The specifically Western move is darker, and it traces to one philological mistake. In Romans 5:12, Paul writes that death entered the world through one man, and through death came to all men, epho pantes hemarton. The Greek phrase epho means because or with the result that. Modern biblical scholarship is unanimous on this. Paul's claim is that all humans die because all humans personally sin on the model Adam set, not because all humans share juridical guilt for what one ancestor did. The Latin tradition, beginning with the 4th century commentator known to scholarship as Ambrosaster, rendered the 4 words as in quo omnes peccaverunt, meaning in whom all sinned. The Vulgate kept the rendering. Augustine, who admitted he read Greek poorly and worked from the Latin, took up the Ambrosaster reading and built an entire doctrine on it. Every human soul carries the guilt of Adam's act, transmitted by sexual generation. The doctrine became original sin in the Western juridical sense. Pelagius, a British monk in Rome, objected on moral grounds. It is unjust to blame an infant for an act committed before its birth. Augustine fought back. The Council of Carthage in 418 condemned Pelagius. The Council of Ephesus in 431 confirmed it. Original sin was now Western Catholic dogma. Augustine's reading became the working anthropology of every Western Christian tradition for the next 1600 years: Catholic, Protestant Reformation, Counter-Reformation, Evangelical. All of them operate inside the Augustinian frame in which Adam is the cause of every human soul's congenital damnation. You do not venerate the people who damned you. This is the specifically Western move. Other cultures rank their first couples lower than the gods. The West ranks them lower and blames them. The Eastern Orthodox tradition, working in Greek and reading epho correctly, never developed the inherited guilt doctrine. The Greek term for what Eastern Christians inherit from Adam is propatorikon har tema, ancestral sin. It means a damaged human nature plus mortality, not personal guilt. Each person's own sins are their own. This is the reason the East kept Adam and Eve in the liturgy, and the West largely lost them. The Eastern Anastasis icon, painted in every Orthodox church, shows the resurrected Christ standing on the broken gates of Hades, pulling Adam and Eve up by the wrists. The earliest surviving Anastasis is a fresco from around 705 AD in Santa Maria Antiqua in Rome, painted under the ethnically Greek Pope John VII. The image then spreads through Middle Byzantine mosaic, late Byzantine fresco at the Chora Church in Constantinople, and 1,000 years of Russian and Greek iconography. Adam is the first person Christ raises. He is named and honored on every Easter wall in Orthodox Christianity. The Western tradition, after Augustine, prefers to leave him there. None of which is to say Augustine was being cruel. the doctrine of original sin is not a sadistic invention. It is what you get when a self-examining culture takes the inner experience of moral failure seriously. Anyone who watches themselves carefully sees the pattern. Knowing what is right does not stop me from doing the wrong thing, and willpower alone does not fix it. The doctrine names that pattern and gives it a theological scaffolding. The scaffolding may be wrong about Adam, but it is observing something real about humans. The Canadian philosopher Charles Taylor, in a 1989 book called Sources of the Self, written around 400 AD, traces a direct line from Augustine's Confessions, written around 400 AD, through medieval monastic self-scrutiny, through Catholic auricular confession, through Reformation interiority, into the modern novel, modern psychology, and the entire modern category of the inner life. Western interiority, the very capacity to ask who am I when I am alone with myself, is largely a Christian invention. The price was guilt. The product was the examined inner life and modern psychology. So when we tell this story, we should not say the West got it wrong. We should say the West paid a particular price for a particular thing it valued. The guilt was real. The moral seriousness it produced was also real. Whether the trade was worth it is for the listener to decide. Now, the mystics, because the literal reading of Adam and Eve as two ordinary people in a real garden a few thousand years ago is a recent and mostly Protestant phenomenon. Almost nobody who thought seriously about the figures in any pre-Reformation tradition read them literally. Long before the Reformation, thinkers like Philo of Alexandria read Genesis through the lens of Greek philosophy. Writing around 30 AD, Philo distinguished two Adams: the heavenly man of Genesis 1, made in the image of God, who is the intelligible idea of humanity, and the earthly man of Genesis 2, molded from clay. For Philo, Adam represented the mind, and Eve represented the senses. The fall was the moment the intellect surrendered to the physical world. 2 centuries later, the early Christian scholar Origen openly mocked the idea of God planting literal trees in an earthly garden. Who is so foolish, he asked, as to suppose that God placed a tree of life that would impart life to anyone who tasted it with their bodily teeth? Origen's point was not that the story is false, it was that the literal reading is so absurd that Scripture clearly intends a spiritual sense. Kabbalah developed a different reading that became enormously influential. The cosmic primordial atom, called Adam Kadmon, is the first form that arises within the empty space left by the divine contraction. From the lights flowing out of his ears, nose, mouth, and eyes, the 4 worlds of Lurianic cosmology unfold. Adam Kadmon is not human, he is the structure of reality. The earthly Adam of Genesis is a much later, much smaller projection of him. Kabbalah also preserved an older rabbinic tradition. The Midrash collection, Genesis Rabbah, records 2 readings of the line, "Male and female he created them." Rabbi Jeremiah ben Eliezer reads it to mean that the first Adam was created as a single androgynous being. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachling reads it differently. God created Adam two-faced, with 2 backs, and later split him in 2. Either way, the original Adam was a Janus-like androgyne. Jacob Boehme, the Lutheran shoemaker mystic of 17th century Görlitz, picked up a version of this reading independently. In a 1923 book called Mysterium Magnum, Adam, pre-fall, contained Sophia, divine wisdom, as his inner female counterpart. He was angelic, androgynous, glorious. The fall began not with the apple, but with Adam's desire to externalize Sophia, to know her as separate. Sophia withdrew. God then formed Eve from Adam's side as the externalized mortal version of the Sophia he had lost. Boehme's Adam is closer to Adam Kadmon than to anything in modern Sunday school. The Sufi mystic Ibn Arabi in 1229 gave Adam another cosmic role. Adam is al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human, the polished mirror in which God contemplates the totality of his own names.
Without Adam, creation would be like an unpolished mirror. God would be present everywhere, but not reflected back to himself. Carl Jung, in a 1951 book called Aeon, read Adam as the archetypal anthropos, the original man whose image surfaces in Gnostic, Mandean, alchemical, and Kabbalistic literature alike. Jung identified the figure with what he called the self, the totality of psyche encompassing both ego and unconscious. The fall of Adam is the necessary alienation that births consciousness. What every one of these readings has in common is that they refuse the literal Adam and Eve. They read the figures as cosmic structures, archetypes, allegories, or stages of consciousness. The literal historical Adam is an outlier reading produced by post-Reformation Protestant biblicism and never accepted by the deep mystical tradition of any religion that included Adam as a figure.
When the genetics arrived in 1987, the literal reading was the one that broke. The mystical readings were unaffected. A literal Adam and Eve as a single ancestral couple is genetically impossible. Different methods, different geneticists, different decades all converge on the same finding. The human ancestral effective population size has never dropped to 2. In 1995, the geneticist Francisco Ayala used the diversity of human immune system genes to argue that our ancestral population had to remain at around 100,000 individuals across many millions of years. Later whole genome studies, beginning with Heng Li and Richard Durbin in 2011, refined the picture. The population dipped to around 10,000 at the bottleneck, but never lower. The numbers shift between methods. The floor is in the thousands, never 2. This conclusion was formally tested in a 2018 exchange between the British plant geneticist Richard Buggs and the American computational biologist Joshua Swamidass. Both Christians, both working in good faith to see whether genetics could rule out a literal two-person Adam and Eve. Their joint conclusion: a strict bottleneck of 2 is genetically impossible within the last roughly 500,000 years. The Catholic Church saw this collision coming. In 1950, Pope Pius XII issued an encyclical called Humani Generis. Paragraph 36 permitted speculation about the evolutionary origin of the human body. Paragraph 37 condemned polygenism. The faithful, Pius wrote, cannot embrace that opinion which maintains that either after Adam there existed on this earth true men who did not take their origin through natural generation from him, as from the first parent of all, or that Adam represents a certain number of first parents. This is an explicit condemnation. It has never been formally rescinded. The operative position has shifted. The 2004 document of the International Theological Commission, issued under the future Pope Benedict XVI, states that physical anthropology and molecular biology combine to make a convincing case for the origin of the human species in Africa about 150,000 years ago in a humanoid population of common genetic lineage. The phrase humanoid population tacitly accepts polygenism, a population, not a couple, without using the word. The most interesting Catholic-friendly workaround comes from S. Joshua Swamidass, the same computational biologist who collaborated with Buggs in 2018. His 2019 book, The Genealogical Adam and Eve, proposes a distinction between genetic and genealogical ancestry. Adam and Eve could be a real historical couple, living maybe 6,000 years ago, not the genetic ancestors of all humanity, but the genealogical ancestors. After enough generations, the genealogical tree of any human extends to almost everyone alive at any given time period in the past, with no genetic trace of most of them. This lets you keep a historical Adam and Eve while accepting genetics.
The genetic story is also stranger than the simple "we came from Africa" textbook version. Modern non-African humans carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA, the result of interbreeding events around 50 to 80,000 years ago. People from Melanesia, Aboriginal Australia, and some Filipino populations carry up to 5% Denisovan DNA, from a sister species we knew nothing about until 2010, when a single finger bone in a Siberian cave was sequenced. The high-altitude EPAS1 gene that lets Tibetans live at elevation came from Denisovan ancestors. Recent papers have also identified what geneticists call ghost African lineages, ancient hominins we have never found fossils of, whose DNA still shows up in modern African genomes. A 2020 paper by Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman found that Yoruba, Isan, Mende, and Gambian populations carry between 2 and 19% ancestry from a ghost lineage that diverged before the Neanderthal modern split. We are not the survivors of a single lineage. We are a hybrid of multiple human populations across hundreds of thousands of years. The out-of-Africa model has been replaced by what Chris Stringer calls African multi-regionalism, a complex network of African populations that produced Homo sapiens over hundreds of thousands of years, then spread out and absorbed at least 3 other human species along the way. What makes us human is harder to say now than it was 30 years ago. Symbolic art, burial of the dead, language genes, abstract thought were all once proposed as uniquely modern human markers. Every one of them now has Neanderthal precedence. Cave paintings in La Pasiega and Maltravieso in Spain are dated to over 64,000 years ago, before Homo sapiens arrived in Western Europe, which means they were painted by Neanderthals. What remains is something more like, we are the lineage that is still here. We are the version of Homo that did not go extinct, partly by absorbing the others. Pull all of this together and the strange final point comes into focus. Every culture in human history has told the story of the first couple. Religion, mythology, and modern molecular biology all reach for the same naming. 3 independent registers, all using the couple shape for the same finding. Someone had to be first. Every culture also ranks the first couple below the gods who made them. Worship moves up to creators, not down to the created. This is universal. Every culture also separates ancestor cult practice from first couple narrative. The household altar holds the named recent dead. The first couple lives in the cosmogonic story everyone shares. Almost no major culture has ever made the literal first couple the active object of altar practice.
The Christian West did one specific thing on top of these universal patterns. Augustine, working from a Latin mistranslation of Romans 5:12, made Adam the source of inherited human guilt. The doctrine produced moral interiority in Western psychology. It also made Adam and Eve psychologically uncomfortable to venerate. The Eastern Church, working in Greek, never made this move and kept Adam and Eve in the liturgy. The mystics never read them literally. Adam Kadmon, Boehme's androgyne, the Sufi perfect human, Jung's anthropos. The deep tradition always read them as cosmic structures, not as historical individuals. The science arrived in 1987 and broke the literal reading the post-Reformation Protestant West had clung to. Here is the final twist. For 200,000 years of human cultural history, the first couple was a story. Every prior tradition required faith to acknowledge them. The Genesis Adam and Eve, Izanagi and Izanami, Fuxi and Nua, Manco Capac and Mama Oklo, all required the believer to assent to a narrative without independent evidence. Mitochondrial Eve and Y-Chromosomal Adam are the first couple in human history who do not. They are the published result of a peer-reviewed paper in Nature. They are not characters, they are measurements. This is a unique moment. For the first time in human history, a culture could practice first couple veneration as something other than mythology. The genetic Adam and Eve are inside every cell of every living human. Their reach is literal omnipresence in the human species. Every theology of divine omnipresence is metaphor. This omnipresence is fact. If divine power means a literal physical connection to every living person, the genetic Adam and Eve possess a reach that earlier cultures could only describe through myth. They offer a shared human origin story written entirely in the language of evidence. The practice the moment calls for already exists in other traditions. Confucian ancestor veneration is structured gratitude without metaphysics. Shinto Oban and Yoruba Egungun do similar work. None of them targets the first couple, but none of them previously had a first couple anyone could acknowledge by epistemology alone. With the genetic Adam and Eve open up is not a new religion, it is a new practice the world has not yet developed. Structured awareness of the chain that produced you, grounded in the only first couple in human history who do not require a story to be true. The cosmic Adam of Boehme and the genetic Adam of the geneticists are both real in different registers. The one inhabits the order of meaning, the other inhabits the order of fact. Western Christianity is the only tradition that ever tried to collapse them into one historical couple in one literal garden, and that was the move that killed the figure for the West. The mystics already knew it was the wrong move. The geneticists figured out why.
The figures are still here. We are still inside them. Whether we mark that or not is up to us. If you enjoyed this episode, the full article with footnotes, images, the comparative first couple gallery, and the full bibliography is on the Crazy Alchemist site. Subscribe wherever you listen for more, and thanks for being here.
If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure to visit crazyalchemist.com for more intriguing content and follow Crazy Alchemist on Instagram and Facebook to stay connected.